Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the U.S. assault on Venezuela with reporter Ben Norton.
If you go talk to average working class Venezuelans, as I did, in poor barrios, these are not highly educated elites, they will speak about the importance of independence for their country. You'll hear them articulate very advanced political concepts that you won't even hear, PhD sociologists here in the US talk about the importance of a multipolar world, about the importance of building an international system that is not beholden to one hegemon, the United States, about building a system of multi-currency finance. And we've seen that Venezuela has also tried to move away from the dictatorship, not just of Washington politically, but economically through the petrodollar. Venezuela has begun listing its oil prices in the Chinese yuan, has been trying to trade in other currencies like the euro.
The United States is openly attempting to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela. The Trump administration, backed by a chorus of Democrats, has announced that the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, who was reelected with over 6 million votes, or 68% of the electorate, is illegitimate. It has anointed by fiat Juan Guaido, who never ran for the presidency and whom over 80% of Venezuelans had, before his self-proclaimed presidency, never heard of. In this Alice in Wonderland world perpetrated by Washington, Maduro is a dictator and Guaido is a standard bearer for democracy. Yet no matter how patently absurd the official narrative is about Venezuela, just about everything the American press says about the country is wrong. Guaido is a stooge with no real following. The country is not convulsed with violence. The Maduro government is not an authoritarian police state. Protests organized by the middle class and right-wing oligarchs that support Guaido and receive their funding from front groups organized by the CIA are not curtailed or crushed by the police. The protests in support of the government are much larger and more frequent, and the military is not about to defect to the sham opposition. Vigilantes are not roaming the country attacking people. And for all the sanctions, lack of food and medicine, and power outages orchestrated by Washington, the country is not in free fall. Joining me to discuss Venezuela is the reporter Ben Norton, who operates the investigative website Gray Zone with Max Blumenthal, who has just returned from an extended trip to the South American country. So you were there for about a month, right?
Yes.
Paint the picture, what you saw, what you reported.
It's hard to speak about the situation in light of the corporate media reporting. It's difficult to express just how ridiculous the corporate media reporting is on Venezuela. This is a country that certainly, yes, has difficulties, but compared to other countries in the region, is actually living quite a normal life. If you go to Colombia, for instance, and you go to Venezuela, you won't notice much of a difference. But of course, if you look at the New York Times reporting and you read about Venezuela, you would think that there's this humanitarian catastrophe. I was not able to see it. I went to numerous states. I didn't go out in the countryside, so the situation could be different there, but throughout Caracas and neighboring states, the situation is actually not very bad. And you also see a few different things. One, that the government is trying to do what it can to push back against some of these difficulties. And two, there is a major popular enthusiasm from the grassroots of Venezuelan society. The Chavista movement has actually transformed society from the grassroots level.
We're talking about Hugo Chavez, the former president,
exactly.
left-wing president.
And it's a movement. Hugo Chavez was democratically elected numerous times, beginning in 1998, and he helped to transform the country from a leadership position. But this is also a revolution that for 20 years has been waged at a grassroots level. And you can fundamentally see that in the way that Venezuelan communities have organized themselves into communes and the way that they help each other in forms of mutual aid and solidarity. This is truly a system that they have built up that cannot be defeated even if they had a cosmetic change in government. And it looks like the coup is already failing. It has been failing since it was initiated on January 23rd.
Well, what always strikes me, and I had to deal with Elliot Abrams, who's orchestrating this kind of soft war on Venezuela. I dealt with them in Central America, is that these people are historically, culturally, and linguistically illiterate. As far as I know, Abrams doesn't speak Spanish. So there is a long tradition in countries like Venezuela just as there was in Iraq with the Ba'athis, of a deep distrust for U.S. imperialism. It's kind of in the DNA of Venezuelans.
And not only is it a recent development, it goes back to the days of Simón Bolívar.
Yeah, all the way back, right.
And what's interesting about this process in Venezuela is that it has always been rooted in this kind of indigenous history. Hugo Chavez, the president, before Nicolás Maduro, extremely popular. Even elements of the opposition have to pay lip service to Chavez because he's just a demigod. He's so popular. Even, again, among more moderate elements of the opposition.
Explain why, what he did, and then we'll talk a little bit about what the U.S. is doing. But talk a little bit about how he transformed the country.
Well, part of what I was going to say is that Chavez stressed his indigenous and African ancestry. He was one of the first...
That's like Morales in Bolivia.
Exactly. This is a country that has been controlled by a largely white European ultra-rich elite right-wing oligarchy for decades upon decades, and many of them now live here in New York or in Washington, and they're the ones trying to help lead this coup from abroad. We see people like Ricardo Hausmann, who's a neoliberal Harvard economist who's trying to work with the Trump administration to privatize Venezuela's oil industry. His last name is Hausmann. These are the European elites. You can look at other people who are descendants of European nobility who ruled Venezuela. And then for the first time, you have Hugo Chavez rise up, and he's democratically elected in 1998. He breaks the stranglehold that the two-party dictatorship had on Venezuelan politics from 1958 until 1998, for 40 years. And Hugo Chavez ushers in this revolution and encourages people to organize communes, encourages people to work together in their communities to make their country better and independent and sovereign, and has always stressed the Chavista movement, since the death of Chavez in 2013, has continued to stress the importance of those points, independence and sovereignty. They have supported that at the United Nations, where the foreign minister, Jorge Ariasa, is working on building a group of countries to support sovereignty and independence and push back against U.S. imperialism. Because if you go talk to average working class Venezuelans, as I did, in poor barrios, these are not highly educated elites, they will speak about the importance of independence for their country. You'll hear them articulate very advanced political concepts that you won't even hear, PhD sociologists here in the U.S. talk about the importance of a multipolar world, about the importance of building an international system that is not beholden to one hegemon, the United States, about building a system of multi-currency finance. And we've seen that Venezuela has also tried to move away from the dictatorship, not just of Washington politically, but economically through the petrodollar. Venezuela has begun listing its oil prices in the Chinese yuan, has been trying to trade in other currencies like the euro.
As Iran has been doing. And this, of course, deeply angers and frightens, in particularly the U.S. capitalist class.
Absolutely, because Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the entire world. That's something that you rarely see acknowledged in media reports. The largest in the world, and of course, unlike Saudi Arabia, which has the second largest, which is on the other side of the ocean, Venezuela is right in what the U.S., under the Monroe Doctrine, calls its backyard. And if you listen to the administration, the Trump administration's rhetoric, they have invoked the Monroe Doctrine. Yeah. They have invoked this language.
But we should just go back to Chavez, because he addressed the grotesque social inequality and the suffering of the Venezuelan underclass, hence his, almost as you point out, deification. Explain what he did. And these kinds of social programs are an anathema to U.S. imperialists who, of course, seek to control the cheap labor and the natural resources. And that's why you have Venezuela often in the same sentence being tied to Nicaragua and Cuba.
Well, Venezuela did exactly what Iran did that led to the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. Mossadegh, the prime minister, was democratically elected in Iran and said, we're going to use the natural resources of our country to benefit the population. And then the CIA and British intelligence helped overthrow Mossadegh. Chavez had the same strategy. When he first was elected, he wasn't even a socialist. He actually was politicized and radicalized.
Let me just interrupt, because neither was Fidel Castro, which a lot of people don't know. But he had that strategy.
Exactly, and they're radicalized through the political process of the U.S. orchestrating coups to overthrow them. Hugo Chavez was elected and thought he would be allowed to govern. He was not allowed to govern, and in April 2002, we saw the foreshadowing of the current coup attempt. There was a military coup that briefly ousted Hugo Chavez, orchestrated in part by the Bush administration. But Chavez was so popular that elements of the military rebelled against the coup regime, which installed, by the way, a right-wing US-trained businessman named Pedro Carmona, who now is supporting the new coup attempt. And the military rebelled against the coup and reinstalled Hugo Chavez, who continued in power until he died in 2013. And we've seen that because of this transformation, Venezuelans value independence so much that they have been willing to fight and endure extreme difficulties. And we should talk about the U.S. is waging a war not just politically against Venezuela, but economically against the entire population. It's a form of collective punishment, not unlike the sanctions imposed on Iran right now, or the sanctions in the past imposed on countries like Iraq. This is a war not just on the political class in Venezuela, but on the entire population as a whole.
How crude would it be to say that the central point is the control of oil?
Well, I think that's certainly part of it, but it's not just part of it. So,
I mean, you had Mike Pence state it.
Well, you had John Bolton state it.
Bolton.
On Fox Business, he went on and he said it would be great if American oil companies could have access to these substantial reserves. That is certainly a major part of this, but it's not just that. So we need to understand that the Chavista movement not only has it been encouraging independence, sovereignty, and socialism, it has also been encouraging the construction of a new global system that is multipolar. They helped create the BRICS system. Hugo Chavez played a leading role in OPEC. And Hugo Chavez, in fact, was one of the main reasons that the price of oil increased so much in the early 2000s. It was because, for the first time, Hugo Chavez exerted Venezuelan leadership inside OPEC and worked with the other oil-producing nations to increase the price of oil to over $100 per barrel. And then in 2014, through a deliberate process in which the Obama administration met with Saudi Arabia and worked out a deal to help provide more support for Salafi jihadist rebels in Syria, in return, Saudi Arabia agreed to overproduce oil to drop the price of oil down to about $30 a barrel. But the reason that the price of oil had been so high, which helped also the Brazilian economy, it helped the Iranian economy, it helped other oil-based economies, because Chavez had worked to increase the prices. Chavez worked through the BRICS system to try to develop a new banking system. He also
Free from the dollar.
He also created what was called the Bank of the South. So one of the reasons, it's not just oil, that is a significant reason, but another reason is that Venezuela has been punching above its weight very significantly and trying to recreate this kind of nine-aligned movement that we saw during the Cold War that we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. It's been assumed that the U.S. dominates the world, and anyone who challenges that, just as anyone who challenged the Roman Empire, is going to face the brunt of that.
When we come back, we'll continue our conversation about Venezuela with reporter Ben Norton. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation about Venezuela and the U.S. attempted coup with reporter Ben Norton. So let's talk about what the U.S. is doing to Venezuela, which certainly mirrors what happened in 1973 in the lead up to the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile.
There's so many parallels. We, for instance, have seen that there have been these blackouts, just as there actually were blackouts.
Just as there were in Chile.
We also have seen the imposition of brutal sanctions. In fact, I interviewed, for a film I'm working on Venezuela, for The Gray Zone, I interviewed the economist Mark Weisbrot, who worked a lot with the Venezuelan government. He's an expert in Venezuelan economics. And he has said that the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela are probably the most brutal sanctions ever imposed on a country, even more brutal than the sanctions imposed on Iraq in the 1990s.
Explain in detail why. Because what I know a little bit. I mean, they have made it impossible for them to refine their own oil, etc. But explain how they have used those sanctions to just, in essence, destroy Venezuela's ability to sustain itself economically.
Essentially, there is a de facto financial blockade. It's similar to the blockade on Cuba, which is a trade embargo, but there's a financial blockade on Venezuela that has made it almost impossible for the government to do business internationally. It's not unlike the sanctions on Iran, where the point is to suffocate the government and prevent them from being able to develop the country, engage in infrastructure
we
projects.
should be clear, they have foreign reserves they can't access.
Well,
I mean, that's what they've done.
They've been stolen from them.
Yeah,
so
stolen.
the Bank of England, for instance, has stolen more than $1 billion worth of gold, physical gold assets that are
was being stored.
And in addition to that, the U.S. government is actually expropriating. The U.S. government can expropriate oligarchs' property here, but they'll expropriate Venezuelan government property, and they have basically stolen Citgo, which is the most important Venezuelan foreign asset, state-owned foreign asset. This is the U.S.-based oil refinery used to refine Venezuelan oil, because Venezuelan oil is heavy crude. They have to lighten it with lighter crude in order to use it. So the U.S. has stolen Citgo, which is property of the Venezuelan government, illegally under international law.
Explain how they stole it. What did they do?
The Trump administration created, through an executive order, sanctions that says that these state institutions no longer are recognized as belonging to the Venezuelan government, and because they're in U.S. territory, the U.S. has expropriated it and given it to the supposed government of Juan Guaidó,
right,
and his class of corrupt Harvard economists who are known as the ISEA boys, like the Chicago boys. They're the equivalent of the Chicago boys in Venezuela. And again, they're led by, I mentioned, Ricardo Hausman, who, we need to mention this name. His daughter, Joanna Hausman, is making videos for the New York Times pushing for regime change without disclosing the fact that her father is the neoliberal brains behind this coup attempt. He was the one who orchestrated the IMF austerity policies that devastated the Venezuelan economy. He is the one that created many of these policies that he now wants to reintroduce. Brutal neoliberal austerity, mass privatization, and especially targeting the oil sector. The so-called Juan Guaido administration, the coup regime backed by Trump, has said very clearly they're working with the Inter-American Developmental Bank. They have said that they want to at least partially privatize the oil industry. What Hugo Chavez did was he kicked out the U.S. oil companies that had dominated Venezuelan oil. He also left the World Bank and the IMF and pushed for an independent development system inside Venezuela. Juan Guaido wants to reincorporate Venezuela into all of this, and the U.S. is blackmailing the Venezuelan population with these sanctions, saying the only time we will lift these sanctions is when Maduro steps down and Juan Guaido is introduced as supposed leader. And we don't even know, even if Juan Guaido were introduced as a leader, would he actually have elections, or would he govern as a dictator who is unelected? Is he going to be replaced by someone like Leopoldo Lopez, who's another far-right opposition leader backed by the U.S., who has engaged in multiple coup attempts? And another point we need to keep in mind is that the opposition in Venezuela is not a peaceful opposition. They have burned people alive. They have hijacked helicopters. This far-right opposition leader, who is seen as a hero inside Venezuela, in June 2017, Oscar Perez hijacked a helicopter and attacked the Supreme Court with grenades. And now you see opposition leaders who have photos of Oscar Perez. They have engaged in a terror war, not unlike the war against Nicaragua, the terror war of the Contras. So we need to understand that there are different layers here of the opposition operating at different levels, and it's not about democracy, it's not about freedom. In fact, at every level, the opposition has made it clear they don't care about democracy. They have boycotted multiple elections, they have fought an internal war against the Supreme Court and against the creation of a constituent assembly, because they don't want the government to govern. They want to block the government, create economic chaos and instability, and eventually lead to the overthrow of that government, whether it's an overthrow internally or potentially even military intervention by Donald Trump. Donald Trump. It's not like Obama's the leader anymore. They're collaborating with a far-right racist billionaire who is deeply anti-Latino, deeply racist against Latinos. And that's the ultimate irony of this all, is that the Obama administration tried indirectly to overthrow Chavez.
Through sanctions. It was the Obama administration that first imposed sanctions.
Yes, and what's interesting about Obama is his strategy was, while he was pursuing rapprochement with Cuba, he was doing this kind of triangulation, putting a wedge in between Venezuela. So he would open the door to Cuba. At the same time, in 2015, Obama declared Venezuela a national security threat. Venezuela is not threatening our national security in any way, shape, or form. In fact, on the contrary, Hugo Chavez created a program where he was giving very cheap, basically free gas and oil to families in the Bronx. The program was called Petro Bronx, to poor working class, largely black and Latino families, to help them heat their houses because they couldn't afford heating. That is what the Bolivarian Revolution has done for Americans here in our country. But the Obama administration said they were a threat to national security because, of course, national security is code word for U.S. corporations' control over the oil reserves in Venezuela and their chokehold on the region. And one other point I haven't even mentioned yet is the importance of the pink tide. The pink tide has been beaten back, but there was a serious moment in the 2000s where, for the first time, Latin America as a region was completely independent from U.S. imperial domination that had controlled the region since the Monroe Doctrine for nearly 200 years. The U.S. saw this region as its own backyard, and you had left-wing elected governments in basically every country. Now those have all been pushed back, and the largest country in the region, in South America, Brazil, now has a fascist president, Bolsonaro, who said his biggest problem with Pinochet in Chile was not the fact that he killed people, it was the fact that he didn't kill enough people. And Bolsonaro has also said that the problem with the military dictatorship in Brazil was that instead of killing people, it just tortured them. This is a man who is deeply racist, deeply violent, deeply authoritarian, and he just met with the CIA at CIA headquarters. He's working with the Trump administration to try to overthrow the Venezuelan government, along with Colombia, another country that is well known for having a great human rights record. No, in reality, Colombia has the highest rate of assassinations of human rights defenders in the entire planet. And Colombia, which is a far-right president that is brutalizing and killing the population, there are still paramilitaries that are active that work hand in glove with the government that are beheading labor organizers. And the Colombian government and the fascist president of Brazil are collaborating with Donald Trump. And people, Democrats, think that they care about democracy in Venezuela. It's really surreal. The empire, I interviewed the foreign minister with my colleagues. We interviewed the foreign minister of Venezuela. And he said very clearly that the mask has been lifted, the mask on the empire.
Well, that's what's so fascinating, because with Allende, the CIA did it secretly. Now there's no attempt to veil what they're doing. It's completely in the open.
It absolutely is. And they're bringing the same people who orchestrated terror wars in Central America. Right. Elliot Abrams is a war criminal. Elliot Abrams is complicit in genocide, literal genocide in Guatemala. Rios Montt, the US-backed military dictator, was actually tried and convicted for crimes of genocide. Elliot Abrams played a key role in supporting the military junta in Guatemala. Elliot Abrams supported the Contra-terror war, where Contra death squads trained by the CIA were massacring not just socialists and Sandinistas, but labor organizers.
Where do you think this is going? Where are we headed? Well, obviously not. The United States has hardly given up. They've not been able to seduce the military or recruit the military to overthrow. Where are they going?
Well, the idea is we're in this for the long haul, and it's going to be collective punishment of the Venezuelan people, like the war against Nicaragua, against the Sandinistas.
Right.
It's going to be a prolonged, protracted war. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing acts of terror and sabotage, as we've already seen, but at a greater level. And it's going to be a war on the infrastructure. And the idea is that the U.S. is going to exacerbate the life for average Venezuelans and make it so difficult that they eventually vote Chavismo out of office. But the will of the Venezuelan people is very strong, and there still is a major grassroots base, and they're not going to go away. The U.S. thinks it can just destroy Chavismo by ousting Maduro, but there at the grassroots level has been a transformation in Venezuelan society.
Is the threat of civil war real? You hear that?
People keep saying that. I didn't see that. If there were to be the beginning of a civil war, the opposition is so small and so unpopular. In fact, even opposition data firms have acknowledged that the opposition is less popular than Maduro. So if there were a protracted violent conflict, the only reason it would be able to continue is because it would have external support from the U.S. And I think it would be, if anything, like the terror war in Nicaragua. And again, Elliot Abrams, who oversaw that terror war, is now in charge of Venezuela policy.
Stop there. Thanks, Ben. That was reporter Ben Norton on the U.S. attempted coup in Venezuela.